everyone, this is Amanda Borchell-Dan.
And I'm Jessica Steinberg,
your host for Times Will Tell,
a weekly podcast from the Times of Israel. Hello, Times Will Tell listeners. We are speaking to Dr. Daniel Arnoff today, CEO of the Fuchsberg Jerusalem Center, and for the purposes of this interview, the newly minted author of About Man and God and Law, The Spiritual Wisdom of Bob Dylan. Hello, Stephen.
Hello, Jessica. I'm glad to be with you.
Very, very happy to have you with us. So, Stephen, as you say in your introduction, here comes another book about Bob Dylan, which I thought was hilarious. I really laughed out loud. And you've probably read many of them, I imagine, or certainly a number of them. But what I wanted to know is, okay, tell me how this book came to be. How many years have you been thinking about this? How long have you been a Bob Dylan fan?
Wow. So first of all, I would say that yes, admittedly, my bookshelf is heavily weighted to the Dylan direction, but that did not happen at the beginning of my interest in rock and roll or in Dylan. That took a while.
Oh, that's okay. Fair enough.
But I just, when we do the, Here's You Here, where I stand and I say, hello, my name is Stephen. Yes, I am obsessed with Bob Dylan, and you say, thank you, Stephen. We love you, Stephen. You'll know that the book obsession started later. That's all. Look, I think that from the beginning of my interest in music, and I was in band since I was a kid and obsessively listening to music and worked as a professional musician for about a decade, Dylan was always in the mix, but I didn't really start thinking about Dylan as a topic of response and study, actually, until I moved to Israel and I was at Beit Midrash Elul in the 90s. And I started to work in the field of kind of rock and roll midrash, right? So that's doing the commentary on the sacred texts of rock and roll. And obviously, if you're going to go to the sacred texts of rock and roll, you're going to go to Dylan. So clearly, I found backup for that in the books I started reading about Dylan and rock and roll. And I found that as I got more interested in it, just the trend lines in how society dealt with popular music were changing also. So now the library of the music section in whatever's left of bookstores is one of the larger libraries outside of sort of fiction and I guess self-help, right?
Interesting, really. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And particularly biographies. For this particular book, I can say that I really felt strongly that a book about Dylan and really about rock and roll in general of this kind had not yet been written. It did feel like there was a niche, there was a gap, there was a lacuna there that I could fill that would be of use, right? That would be of use to music fans. People are interested in religion, people are interested in spirituality. And like many people, when life slowed to almost a halt for the reasons of Corona, I decided that I was in between projects. And I started a podcast that we can talk about, and the podcast was meant to inspire a book, and it happened. And now the podcast is in its third season, and the book is coming out on May 3rd.
Wow. So you were very productive during the height of the pandemic.
At some elements of my life, and at others less productive, right?
Fair enough.
I was very productive with junk food as well, but that doesn't really count for much.
I ate a lot of croissants, and I did make sourdough. So there you have it.
There you go.
We all had our areas of productivity for sure.
That's right.
Okay, but let's step back a little bit then to you as a musician and to you and your clear love. And I think you said obsession with Bob Dylan. Maybe you didn't say obsession. You did. Okay. So talk to us a little bit about Bob Dylan and Bob Dylan's music for you. What is that about? What is at the root of it? What is it? What does he mean to you?
Yeah, Dylan was definitely present in my house growing up, along with the Beatles and the band and the Moody Blues and Bruce Springsteen, because my father is a big music fan. So I inherited from him a record collection that really was kind of the playlist for classic rock circa, whatever. For me, I think that for me and for many people, Dylan captures a place that lives between poetry and rock and roll and religion. It took a little while to get into it because, truthfully, I was much more into Tom Petty and Bruce Springsteen.
You do mention Bruce Springsteen. You mentioned Bruce Springsteen quite a few times.
Look, Jessica, I'm from Cleveland. I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. If you're, a white dude of a certain age from Cleveland, Ohio, it's kind of a thing, right? Because that was one of Bruce Springsteen's big cities in the 70s and 80s when I was coming of age as a musical person. And I think for Dylan and me and our journey together that he knows nothing about and I know all of this about, right? It's it really has remained that nexus of things that are really important to me. The written word, the heard word, music, and the book is about sort of, for me, the key issues of our time, maybe of any time, and how Dylan frames them, relates to them, feels about them, and teaches them, really, because I see him as not just a ne'er-do-well rocker with an incredible genius for words and music, but also as a kind of figure of wisdom, or even what we might call prophecy, in terms of being able to frame for us what matters in life and give it to us in a way that we can hear it.
Okay, right. So which definitely brings us in many ways into the heart of the book. So you write at some point that you're not going to fiddle with Dylan and Jewish mysticism, nor the Jewish elements of Dylan's own personal story, which maybe there was like a little bit later on that I caught. But you just hinted toward this. But if you had to encapsulate the spiritual wisdom of Bob Dylan, if you had to, in a few sentences, or more than a few sentences, what would it be? What is the spiritual wisdom of Bob Dylan?
I was amazed that I actually found an answer that I didn't expect in this. In answering this question, actually, I'm not fiddling around with my answer here. This actually happened to me, and I remember when it happened. And I had a couple close friends who are writers and in the world of music, and I shared it with them when it happened. And essentially, I was stuck in the book and wasn't sure that I had found an answer to the question. And then it sort of came to me as a question, which is the question from Like a Rolling Stone, 1965, Like a Rolling Stone, up until recently was voted by the biblical scribes at Rolling Stone magazine, named after the song, Like a Rolling Stone, right? That was the number one song of the top songs of rock and roll. It asks again, Dylan asks again and again in the song, how does it feel? How does it feel? And
how
the answer,
does it feel?
That's right. Yeah. You nailed it. That's right. Listen to you. It is the question of our time, and the answer is the story of why Dylan matters. And to me, I would even boil it down into one word, and the word is empathy. The word is empathy. I believe that Dylan's spiritual wisdom can be boiled down to empathy. That's what I call it. Yeah.
Wow, that was not what I expected you to say. And it's funny, I've been reading the book over the last few days in preparation for this conversation, and I assume you write that somewhere. Yeah. But I'm not sure that I saw it quite written in quite that amount of clarity.
It comes in the final, I'd say, I don't know, the final fifth of the book.
Oh, okay. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, and I try to wrap it up, and I was thinking a lot about some really important work that's been done recently by Daphne Brooks, who's at Yale now, who writes about Black feminist critique and Black feminist music. Catherine Lofton, who's also at Yale, who writes about about cultural appropriation and white musicians and black musicians and the whole themes of electricity and race, going back to this pivotal moment where Dylan, quote unquote, goes electric right around the time of Like a Rolling Stone at the Newport Folk Festival, sort of famously, and really tried to suss, what is next. If there's an age of rock and roll, which maybe is past by definition because we have classic rock by the 80s. We already are talking about classic rock. They were all alive, the ones who survived, right?
Alive and performing.
And reinventing themselves. Dylan and Paul Simon and Neil Young and then there's a whole next generation, the next and the next. But basically, as I tried to bring the book to some form of a conclusion, or at least some sort of speculation about where music goes, it really became clear to me that the rhetorical questions that Dylan asks, and he does ask really classic rhetorical questions like, how does it feel? Like the question of how many roads must a man walk down before you can call him a man, right? Blown in the wind.
Yeah, right.
It is about creating a space to actually experience life within a framework, with a good question, with other people, to actually make something new by repeating the question over and over again. So to me, the process of writing the book actually renewed a little of my faith in rock and roll a little bit, because I understood that amongst the many things that rock and roll does, it is a story of intimate moments that a musician is sharing with the masses, right? So Dylan's sharing his internal life. Any musician of the genre is sharing their internal life, and they're sharing it with the masses, and you experience alone with your earbuds or on your record player or whatever age and media you use, and yet you're sharing it with millions of people. Everyone is being asked how do they feel. Everyone's feeling something when they encounter music, and the ways that music gets shared amongst people, sometimes we aren't even conscious of how that's happening, but it is this incredible vehicle for empathy. And I think Dylan is one of the catalysts in bringing that to the masses in popular culture.
You're reminding me of the section. I love this section. I actually pulled it out to read it about the popular music pilgrimage, the gathering at a concert. I was also a frequent concert attendee in my day. So here, I'm just going to read it. I hope I get it all right, because I did write it over here on my notes. Those show parking lots look like it's not show parking lots, but the parking lots look like a temporary village of pilgrims gathered for preparatory ablutions outside of an oracle or temple, everyone chanting the liturgy of favorite songs from encampment to encampment, car stereo to boombox, hunt, mate, rage, get lost. It all happened at a rock concert, a place of learning many secrets under the not watchful eyes of the musicians who had brought everyone together, which of course was the scene of, for me in the 80s, very, frequently. Totally. And hopefully for many people, not for my husband, but for many people that I know and love.
It's not too late.
And it's not too late. I know. I keep on telling him that. But I don't know. Is it the same anymore? That's number one question. The scene in the parking lot. Does it happen in the same way? It's been a long time since I've been in that scenario, at least in the States. Let's take a quick break, and then we'll be back with Dr. Stephen Daniel Arnoff, the author of About Man and God and Law, the Spiritual Wisdom of Bob Dylan. And we're back with Stephen Daniel Arnoff.
Yeah, he's just relaunched his quote-unquote never-ending tour, and it's booked for the next 3 years. It's booked through 2024.
And he's 80...
He's 81. He'll be 81 on May 24th.
Oh, the timing is very nice.
Yeah, it matches one of the birthdays of one of my kids, I have to say, who was so kind and funny to choose to be born. Obviously, the mother had a lot to do with it too, and she did the work, but the kid, decided when to come out, I think, and it was on Bob Dylan's birthday, which is kind of amazing for someone who's so interested in Dylan. But he's at the age of almost 81, planning to be on tour for at least another 2.5 years.
But what does tour mean for him these days? What do concerts mean for him?
It means that he's out there in spurts of 15 to 20, 25 dates essentially in a row. He could do 100 dates a year. I think the average at the peak of the Neverending tour was something like 90 shows a year. And we're talking about for more than 2 decades.
Wow. And these are, what size what are we talking about? Are we talking about smaller venues, larger venues?
He plays some festivals, but it's varied. There were 2 summers where he only played, get this, minor league stadiums, minor league baseball stadiums, only minor league baseball stadiums. All right. So, you know where minor leagues are not located typically in LA,
No.
Chicago, New York, and Miami. They're in small towns.
Yeah.
He would be on tour with John Cougar Mellencamp, and Dylan would tour only minor league stadiums. Willie Nelson and Dylan. I saw Dylan and Willie Nelson play in Cooperstown, New York, at the Baseball Hall of Fame.
Baseball Hall of Fame.
Field. He plays the outdoor shells. He plays theater-style concerts like the Beacon or the Capitol Theater in Manhattan and outside of New York. But he also plays in larger venues. He'll play at Madison Square Garden. So it's really a mix. And
how many times have you seen him perform?
Oh gosh, probably maybe 20 times, I would say.
Okay.
Probably.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
A dedicated
that's probably
fan,
around
one
20.
could call you. Yes.
But definitely not in the rankings of the numbers of times that people who are really dedicated have seen Dylan. I mean, there's a whole world of people. They're called Bobcats.
Right.
And
right.
they have seen Dylan hundreds of times, right? Hundreds of times. So
But they may not have written a book. So
they might not have written a book, but they will certainly tell me all the mistakes I made in the book. I can promise you, social media is full of them.
Oh, I'm sure. Right. You must be kind of butterflies in the stomach about when this thing is actually out there. And
yeah, but not so much. My goal in writing the book was absolutely not to prove in any way that I knew more or less than anybody else. I wasn't interested in actually writing a book that was too concerned about linear history, the chronology of Dylan, what he ate for breakfast, what religious practices he takes on. As you mentioned, I was interested in what it means and really recognize that ultimately I can associate what I think it means to all kinds of other people, and many of them, much more knowledgeable and engaged in different fields than I am. But at the end of the day, this was my attempt to provide a framework for experiencing Dylan deeply, for experiencing rock and roll in a different way, and really trying to make a case, which I think will be an interesting one to talk with, friends and colleagues about for a long time, about how rock and roll is a framework that provides spirituality and religious ritual experience and is a meaning-making machine for millions and millions of people who don't get that from religion. They get that from music. They get that from culture.
okay, so then spinning off of that, in your work, in your professional life, you deal a lot with Judaism and Jews and people who are following religious practice. And as you've mentioned, you also had a long period of your life where you were a musician, a professional musician, and you clearly are living these two streams, right? Was it hard for you to resist? I mean, you obviously, you bring up Midrash, you bring up other Jewish aspects of your own life or thinking, but was it hard for you to stay away from finding more of a connection between Dylan and his Jewish background, his birth?
Well, first of all, I didn't shy away at all and never would from his deep Christian roots as well, both culturally and during a period of time where he really engaged full on with evangelical Christianity. And who's to say if he isn't still engaged with it? It's very hard, I think, to be a musician who's immersed in blues and in gospel and also in the sort of Americana formative country music without being immersed in Christianity.
Right.
So that's key for him, just like it's key for Paul Simon or anybody else who comes of age as a musician. I do think that Dylan is a genius who is defined in certain ways by an incredible memory for what he hears, reads, sees in the world. And part of the process that he enters, and he talked about that in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, which he recorded when he didn't attend the ceremony.
Right. I do remember that.
Right. So how does he reproduce the content that goes into that machine, into his mind, that makes music? In recent years, there's been a lot more controversy around Dylan as a plagiarist, as someone who's really actually taking content and simply reproducing it as his own in a slightly different form. That may be the folk tradition always being that way. I think there's a pretty strong case for that. It's a little different when you're a white male reproducing the sounds or the lyrics of someone who perhaps doesn't have the privilege, right, to reproduce on the stage that Dylan
or
can.
The stage.
That's a thing.
Right.
Sure, that's a thing. But end of the day, Judaism and Jewish texts are in the mix because there's incredible wisdom in Judaism, right? The classic texts of the Jewish tradition are classic texts not just because they appeal to Jews, but because they are appealing texts. They were so appealing to certain Jews that Christianity developed out of that. And that is deeply rooted within the whole question of where is Dylan in the scale of, Judeo-Christian belief, practice, text, whatever. To me, it doesn't matter. To me, what matters is that he's an artist who expresses in a contemporary voice, through a contemporary lens, the great questions that seekers and prophets and seers have always been asking, going all the way back as far as we can go back with culture and religion.
What was the toughest question that might have come about as a result of writing the book, besides trying to figure out the answer? But in other words, what were some unexpected things? You go into a subject, you go into a book, you know a lot about the subject, you obviously have research to do as well. Was there anything that really struck you as, wow, I did not expect to learn that or to think about this that way?
Well, that's a great question. I did get stuck in certain points when I was thinking about Dylan as a student. I have a chapter on student and teacher. I talk about Dylan and Woody Guthrie or Johnny Cash or even Lenny Bruce, like people that he has publicly and creatively admired, and ask the question, well, how could it be that someone who has been such a great student and has been mentored by so many, who did he teach? Does he have students? Does he have disciples? Where in the system is that? Or is he like the Rebbe who refuses to have, any students? That was one. And the other one was really around sort of contemporary issues of race and feminism and where to put this guy who, on the one hand, seems to be quote-unquote ally to the disempowered or the underempowered or people who don't have the same kind of privilege, if we could say it that way. What does it mean that he is really a musician who is just like me, a white Jewish male, and in our world right now, it's not exactly the platform that one would want to be on to be most current, right, with saying something that matters. So how does it feel is an amazing question in the 60s when boys will be boys and it's totally accepted. It's very different in 2022 where it's not acceptable to, take in all that power and all that access as a white man, right? Particularly one who is living really well off of music that's inherited by people of color, women, what have you. So that was a tough one for me, and for that I really had to lean into some friends and colleagues, who have done a lot of work on that, and those themes of appropriation, empowerment, and so on, and kind of get a little bit of permission maybe to still state what I wanted to say about Dylan and to be I don't know, you might call it a chevruta, sort of study partners.
Study partners.
And the study partner element, the chevruta portion, helped me get comfortable that there was a reason to have one more of the hundreds more, right, book about this guy.
Huh. Right. Not easy when there's this icon and you're delving into it and you find the things that you don't necessarily love, or you're delving further into that. Not fun.
There's plenty in there not to love, as much as there is to love. But one of the, I think, powerful elements of popular music, and I think that's probably true of our world of celebrity as it exists today, is that the imperfections are not hidden. The imperfections of brokenness that Dylan describes in himself, like most great artists, are glaring portraits of human imperfection, which is one of the reasons why I think he can ask the question, how does it feel? Because he's showing you that it feels bad sometimes, really bad. Sometimes it feels amazing. Sometimes it feels beautiful. But it changes and it's unpredictable. And just because, this guy has, 15 houses and a castle in Scotland doesn't mean that he's not suffering along as a human being just like everybody else. And I think that's beautiful. I think the fact that he stayed in the game and is still talking about love and heartbreak and America and race and JFK's assassination and Martin Luther King, and these are, I think, a great tribute. He's not sitting back writing and complaining about the fact that his castle is not being taken care of by the servants. He's still in the thick of it as a human.
Right. Right. And that's the other thing about Dylan, is that the concept of social media and celebrityhood are not things that he has really ever delved into in a he's stayed far away from it. Whereas many others have not. And, it's easy to always scoff at celebrityhood and what people bring upon themselves when they put their lives out there. On the other hand, you get to know them in a different way, or maybe you do, right? Do we ever really know anyone? And that's always the feeling. When you have someone that, like Dylan, who is such an icon, people want to feel like they know him. And on one hand, as you're pointing out, you get to know him through his songs. But on the other hand, do you really?
Yeah, it's a funny one. That's a really interesting way to put it, Jessica, because there's this theme that I touch on where in a song Dylan writes called Lenny Bruce, he calls Lenny Bruce the comic who was a kind of genius, another Jewish genius in this particular case, who really got lost in drugs and frustration, and he really was a groundbreaking comic for issues of censorship and what we could talk about. And Dylan calls him the brother that you never had in that song. And when Bruce Springsteen was asked to induct Bob Dylan into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, Springsteen described Dylan as the brother that you never had. And I don't feel at all like Dylan's a brother. He feels almost alien in a certain way because he's such a immense presence creatively in our world. Yeah,
untouchable in many ways.
But at the same time, he does find ways to help you be a better brother, right? It's about ways that a great musician can actually enhance the ways we can be better people, more intimate with the people that matter to us. And ultimately, I think that rock and roll has been created this world of our imaginary friends in a way that didn't exist before. Because think about it, 100 years ago, it would be very uncommon for you to have anything out loud except what was being said or played in the room with you. You couldn't have other voices in the room. But, when you and I came of age, and certainly, in the age when our parents came of age, and our grandparents as well, certainly, there were voices in the room with us. We weren't alone. We weren't alone because we had Joni Mitchell, and Jimi Hendrix, and Bob Dylan, and Elton John, and then we had, Tracy Chapman, and we had Kurt Cobain, and Beyonce, and now we have Adele, and we have great friends, right, around all the time, and they're talking to us whenever we want. It's kind of an amazing shift for humanity.
Okay, so who's the next book about?
Oh, the next book. That's a question that many in our community of one have been debating here. I'll tell you what. I had an idea to do another book about rock and roll called The Rock and Roll Empire, but I'm kind of backing down from that. I actually have 2 novels. One of them's in the can. It's about football and
football, American football.
American football. It's called Take a Knee. I may go back to that, but the other one is one that I kind of started when I took a break from this book, and it is about a kind of failed rock and roller who's going to make a big comeback. So that could be the one. That could be the one.
I see the Netflix series already. I mean,
yeah, I'm glad that someone does. We'll be back. We'll be back for the conversation about that book. It's called Mistake on the Lake, because this rock and roll story takes place in Cleveland, where I'm from, and Cleveland is known to some, but was known to many as the Mistake on the Lake. But I'm here to say,
you're from there and you're proud of it.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a choice. I am part of the Cleveland diaspora, okay? But in thinking about why I got so interested in rock and roll, a lot of it has to do with the fact that Cleveland had this incredible radio station called WMMS when I was a kid, and it really was the great station of contemporary rock and roll, and that's why the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is in Cleveland. So that for those of us looking for a comparison, that was my Yavne or Jerusalem or wherever the capital of learning was for rock and roll. It was Cleveland.
That was
for
yours.
A while. Yeah.
All right. Go Cleveland. All right.
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah. Cleveland rocks. You know the tune.
Absolutely. I'm not going to sing it though.
One song a session. I guess you've reached your quota.
It was just 4 words. Maybe it was 5. But Stephen Arnoff, it has been a pleasure to have you here on Times Will Tell. We're really happy to have spoken to you. And so let's just go over what's that About Man and God and Law, the Spiritual Wisdom of Bob Dylan, coming out in May 3rd, I believe
May 3rd is the publication date, available wherever fine books are sold, and people want more of the podcast. I do a lot of appearances and scholar residencies and so on. mangodlaw.com.
Okay, we will link to that website for sure. And as for you, Times Will Tell listeners, we'll be back on Sunday with the Daily Briefing. See you then. Bye, Stephen.
Bye.
Thanks so much for listening to Times Will Tell from the Times of Israel, and thanks to our producer, Gilad Brownstein.
Please subscribe wherever you find your podcasts and check out our Daily Briefing news show every Sunday through Thursday.
Like what you hear? Consider rating us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to spread the word.
Until next week.
Shalom.